Good afternoon and welcome to everyone. Please continue to enjoy your meal as we get our proceedings underway here. I'd like to welcome you all to the Herman Kahn Center here in Indianapolis, so named for our beloved late founder Herman Kahn, one of this century's leading thinkers and futurists. My name is Kurt Smith and I'm Hudson's Vice President and Chief Operating Officer as well as your host for our important book discussion today. This discussion captures very well Hudson's rich tradition of speaking to contemporary public policy issues, often from a contrarian point of view, a view that challenges conventional thinking, as well as an eye toward the future. Hudson is America's lone international think tank located away from our nation's coastlines. So this gives us a special responsibility to voice the values of the heartland and the common sense at the heart of the American people that is all too often lost in the discussions that pass for informed public debate in Washington and other major centers of commerce and thought. We take this responsibility seriously, and though we maintain a major presence in Washington, Hudson seeks always to embody a healthy skepticism about conventional wisdom, a guardedly optimistic view of the future, and an abiding respect for the importance of beliefs, cultures, and faith in human affairs. Now let me briefly explain the format of today's book discussion and then introduce our speaker, Lieutenant General William E. Odom. The General will give us an overview of his book and then speak to some of the issues that are come from that on the continent of Europe today, specifically Yugoslavia and the Balkans. After his remarks, we'll be happy to take questions because we have cameras here today and because of the room. If you could write your questions on the cards we've put on the tables and pass them forward, I'll present those to the General for you. We are indeed fortunate to have Lieutenant General William E. Odom with us today. General Odom heads the Hudson Institute's National Security Studies Center and is one of our senior fellows. In addition to these significant responsibilities, the General teaches at Yale University and is a frequent speaker and expert commentator on world military and political events. During his distinguished public service career in the United States Army and at the highest levels of our national government, General Odom has served in a variety of postings. Among his many notable and important responsibilities was his service in the mid-1980s as the director of the National Security Agency. The NSA, of course, is the arm of our intelligence community responsible for intercepting signals and guarding America's own top-level military and diplomatic communications. This work is so sensitive and so secret that the security classification the General enjoyed is itself a classified secret. Before this posting in the Reagan administration, the General had a more public role. He served as the military assistant to President Carter's national security advisor, Zbigniew Brzezinski, and frequently advised the President and top White House officials and military officials in that administration on military and strategic options, again, particularly focused on European issues and the Soviet military threat. But in addition to his exemplary service to our nation as a soldier and a statesman, the General is also a scholar. He graduated from the United States Military Academy, better known to many of us as West Point, and then received a master's degree from Columbia University, which was soon followed by a doctorate also from Columbia, awarded in 1970. He continues this love of sound, serious scholarship today, which he pursues as a Hudson Senior Fellow, as an adjunct professor at Yale, and as an acclaimed author. It is his latest book, his sixth, which has won both critical praise as well as a measure of popular success rarely bestowed on think tank books, that brings the General to us today. Please join me in welcoming General William E. Odom. General, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. As a Tennessean, it's a real pleasure to be here in Indiana today. I know some of your most illustrious citizens. I'm a great admirer of Senator Lugar, whom I've known for some years now and have a chance to exchange views with occasionally. And of course, Lee Hamilton, Congressman Lee Hamilton, who now runs the Wilson Center in Washington. He used to come out to NSA and lecture when he was on the House Intelligence Committee, and it was always an edifying experience. I knew I was on the right airplane this morning when I saw him getting on, and so I just followed him. So you owe my presence here partly to his good sense of direction. Now, think I'll just move this down so we can hit. The subject is, as Kurt Smith said, this book, and it's a difficult one. The temptation is to tell you the whole story, but that would take far more time, I think you realize, than I have or you have to hear it. And it would save you the trouble of buying the book, which would be a mistake on my part. So I think the best way out of this predicament, I've decided, is to avoid a direct summary and go to the very end and start working back as to why the Soviet military collapsed, and then discuss some of the implications for today. Thus, to begin at the end. At the end, I do a historical excursion, which I'm going to ask you to go along with me on. Russian and Soviet history have been defined by three structural problems. The so-called peasant question, or in the 19th century euphemism for how to develop the economy in Russia, which way it should go, an agricultural economy or an industrial economy. The military question, how to meet the ever-expanding military needs of the empire, and the nationality question, the problem of how to justify and impose Russian rule over dozens of non-Russian peoples and territories. Now, these three structural problems have formed a kind of dynamic, vicious circle in Russia, one from which it has had one or two chances to escape. And I'll explain in more detail. Russia was consolidated in the Muscovy part as an imperial state under Ivan III in the late 1400s. He not only conquered all the other Russian princes and made him his service nobility, but those of you who know the history know that the Mongols ruled over Russia at the time. He threw off this so-called Tatar yoke, or the Mongol rule, after the Tatars had actually helped him and his predecessors subdue these other Russian princes. The Mongols favored the Muscovite princes, not because they were better fighters, but because they were better tax collectors. And for that reason, they were allowed to bash the skulls of their fellow princes, bring them under their control, and in exchange they extracted the revenues. But Ivan went further. He expanded Muscovy's territory beyond Russian ethnic boundaries and took a big chunk of Lithuania. Lithuania was a much bigger country at that time. It had all of the Baltics and right down into what's the central part of what's modern Ukraine today. It took 20 years of war for him to do this, and it cost lots of money, which Ivan extracted from his peasantry, leaving it absolutely impoverished. Villages virtually destroyed from tax extraction by the end of his rule, about 1500, 1504. But from his time, and he changed his name from being Prince of all Russias to being Caesar. Tsar in Russian means Caesar. Caesar of Moscow, the third Rome. The first Rome had been Rome, the second Rome had been Constantinople, the Byzantine Empire, and the third Rome was Moscow. Now from that time up to about 1700, Peter the Great arrives on the scene, Russia expanded rapidly. Every year, on average, gaining a territory about the size of modern Benelux, the Belgians, Netherlands, and Luxembourg combined. Many non-Russian peoples fell under Russia's rule in that imperial development, and most did not like it. Thus, the military costs of expanding were only part of the total. To keep the empire together required a sustained and large budget for military expenditures. Now, from 1700s up to the late 1900s, actually the 1980s, the average annual expansion was a territory about the size of the state of Vermont. And by this time, the Soviet Union occupied 1/6 of the Earth's land surface, and over 100 national minorities were under Soviet rule, and 14 of them had their own national republics. The Tsar, unlike feudal monarchs in the West, never conceded any rights to his nobility. The entire land was his estate, and the nobility was his administrative class, governing the peasantry, extracting not only taxes but also soldiers for his army. The essence of the Russian state was military, and the Tsar always looked upon himself as top soldier. As Peter Struve said in early 1900s, Struve was initially a Marxist, but then became a classical liberal or legal Marxist at the turn of the century, shortly before the Russo-Japanese War in 1904-05. He said that to restore Russia without the army is impossible. The army is not these or those generals, no matter how great their contribution. The army, this is the official being of Russia. Now, defeat in the war, the Crimean War in 1855, in the middle part of the 19th century, was the first such defeat in the history of the empire. They had lost battles, and they had been close to losing wars, but they never really lost a war since Peter's time, in around 1700. And this defeat prompted major economic, judicial, and military reforms, including the emancipation of the serfs, primarily because they had proven to be poor soldiers against literate Englishmen and Frenchmen who were serving only 4 years rather than 25 years. Defeat again in 1904 in the Russo-Japanese War caused a revolution of 1905, and that led to the promulgation of the October Manifesto, permitting political parties, elections, and the State Duma as a parliament. This reform took Russia almost to a constitutional democracy. Not a constitutional democracy, but a constitutional monarchy. But not quite. The Tsar stubbornly refused to go all the way, and he retained his ancient claim to be responsible only to God, not to any constitution or the Duma or any general principles. Thus, a kind of make-believe parliamentary system emerged in this decade before World War I broke out. The war, of course, exhausted Russia again, and the old regime collapsed in 1917, as you probably remember, but after several months of attempting to create a liberal parliamentary system, the so-called provisional government, the Bolsheviks seized power and launched the Soviet Union. Now, a couple of conclusions are important from this survey. First, the regime always distrusted free market economics because the Tsar and his ministers feared losing control of the economy, especially industry, which they wanted to produce military power as first priority. Second, the military requirements, both to sustain the empire and to expand it, were ever and ever larger and depended on a modern military-industrial base, which Russia had great difficulty creating because of its very large peasant-based agrarian economy. Third, nationalism, as a new idea after the French Revolution, was catching on in the Russian Empire, threatening to break it apart. Those of you who know about the Polish uprisings in 1830-31 and then again 1861, 62, 3 in that period will understand how that's related. Now, when the revolution came in 1917 and Lenin arrived back on the scene, he used all three of these old questions issues: the economy with its land-hungry peasantry, the nationality question with his demand for national self-determination, and the military issue. He used that by calling for peace and instant demobilization. As the peasants began to defect and the army became unreliable, national minorities began demanding independence. Finland, Poland, the Ukraine, for examples. The military was the glue that had held this empire together, and as it weakened, the empire collapsed. Now, we know Lenin began revising these policies as soon as he'd taken power, but you can see his keen political instincts as to where the weak seams were in the regime. He had all three of these, and he came down. As soon as he seized power in 1917, in November, he became worried about the Ukraine. Ukraine had elected a Rada and declared itself independent of the Russian Empire. Lenin sent forces down there, threw the Rada out, and said, "You will not leave." The next spring, or later in the winter, February the 23rd, 1918, he founded the new Red Army. Now, it took a while to build it, but this was a reversal of having no standing armies. His answer to the military question in 1917, that's reversed. He used this army throughout the next 3 years of Civil War against movements in the Ukraine, the Caucasus, and Central Asia, but he lost Finland, he lost Poland, and he lost the Baltic states. And while he tried to collectivize the peasants, he realized that he did not yet have sufficient power to do this by force. While he waited on the revolution to take place in Europe, Central Europe, he thought the revolution would break out there and save the small working class in Russia. Of course, it didn't happen. But he used a voluntary approach to trying to put the peasants into collective farms. Now, finishing this task would be left to Stalin, along with achieving the most centralized control over the economy ever with his first 5-year plans. Once that was done in the 1930s, the military again had priority, and the new Soviet empire not only became stable, but also able to expand, especially during and after World War II. Now, you may wonder why I take you on this historical trip. As I searched for the reasons that Gorbachev launched perestroika, I was struck by one thing above all else. He did not start as a political liberal. He did not even understand what liberal democracy or market economics are about. Rather, he and all of his Politburo colleagues, and I was able to talk to 4 of the Politburo members, former Politburo members, agreed on one thing, and his senior military. The cost of the military had become far too large to continue to carry. Both the war in Afghanistan and the arms race with the West, they had decided had become too much to continue. Political reform, however, was not even considered. Politburo members seemed to believe that the old command economic system that Stalin had created could be used to make this shift from guns to butter. We're producing too many guns, we need to produce more butter. That was really simplistically the way they looked at the problem. They did not have a clue that their problem was systemic, that the command economic system itself was the problem. It was a permanent war mobilization system, and there was no way to make it efficient without introducing a market, which required private property and legal reforms. Now, that was the first naive misconception. The second one concerned arms control. Gorbachev believed that arms control treaties with the West would allow him the kinds of military reductions that he wanted to solve his economic problems. He went to work to get such arms treaties. First, he established close personal ties with the West European leaders and even President Reagan at the Reykjavik summit in Iceland. If they trusted him, then he could convince them to take big chances, and he could also use that argument at home. Now, when he went home to convince his own military and military-industrial leadership, he faced a reluctant military, and he faced an even more and more stubbornly reluctant military-industrial elite. They could cite the ideology, Marxism-Leninism, as a basis for the military. After all, according to Marx and Lenin, war with was inevitable with the capitalist class because it would not surrender peacefully. Thus, all countries with market economies were de facto, by ideological definition, enemies. They were threats. The Soviet military and the general staff could say, well, we have to be prepared to defeat all those countries. There were so many market-based countries in the world that virtually gave the Soviet military a blank check on the economy. Now, Gorbachev dealt with this ideological challenge simply. He revised the ideology. He insisted that class struggle and class interest were no longer high priority, and that instead the priority should go to humankind interest, an expression he found somewhere in Marx or Lenin, I've forgotten where, but nobody had heard of it until he suddenly found it. And he says, humankind interests are things like avoiding nuclear war or avoiding international ecological disasters. Thus, the Soviet Union, if these were to be the priorities, could cooperate with the imperialist states of the West. If that were so, and if as Gorbachev was arguing in this new ideological revision, if military power could no longer be used to settle quarrels with the West, then the Soviet military no longer had a blank check on the Soviet economy. In other words, in a stroke of an ideological pen, he just removed their justification for what they had been spending. And he plowed ahead till he got the INF Treaty in late 1987, his very first. Surprising to him, the INF Treaty did not save a lot of money. It certainly didn't ease the economic problems. Thus, at the end of '88, a year later, you may recall, he came before the United Nations in December, General Assembly, and said that he was going to reduce the army, the Soviet military, by 500,000 personnel and so many thousand tanks, airplanes, etc. This was a fairly large unilateral step. Now, to overcome the domestic resistance, not only from the military, but also from the military industrialists and the conservative wing of the Politburo, he pushed for wider and wider use of the term, which you all remember, glasnost. That is, allowing people to voice freely the genuine political feelings they have in their mind. Now, Moscow intellectuals loved this and began to raise all sorts of questions about the legitimacy of the Soviet Union. After all, intellectuals, the chattering class, they're the ones that really want to talk, not the ordinary people. Now, so he let them have voice and they used it. Now, more important, the national separatist movements within the Soviet Union began to emerge using glasnost, and they were beginning to emerge within these national republics. Why Gorbachev didn't see this as a danger was a mystery to me. I really don't know the answer, other than what his old colleagues have said. His old ally, Ligachev, became his opponent. He did see this danger, and that caused him to abandon support of Gorbachev and to begin his fight to stop perestroika. I remember having dinner with Ligachev at Yale in the fall of 1991, before the Soviet Union collapsed. And he explained to a group of 5 or 6 of us that my quarrel with Gorbachev is this misunderstanding or difference of viewpoint. He thinks that the issue is reformers versus conservatives. I think it is the center versus the regions, the nationalities. I think Ligachev was right, and Gorbachev was not in this regard. Now, that led Ligachev to oppose perestroika, certainly from the summer of 1987 on. Now, glasnost also unleashed another set of dangerous forces. It allowed for criticism of the generals and military life. Now, the cruelty and mistreatment of soldiers was notorious, and people knew about this individually, but it had never been admitted publicly. Now, radio, television, the print media began to report all sorts of horrible, horrible things about life in the military, including thousands of non-combat deaths, injuries, suicides, homosexual rapes, drugs, corruption in the senior officer corps. The result was that by the spring of 1989, they had a huge conscription revolt. In the Baltics, only about 10% of the expected recruits were actually brought on active duty. In other words, a massive resistance to the semi-annual call-up. They have a call-up twice a year, in the spring and in the fall. Now, in the other 90% hid or evaded conscription by one means or another. In the Caucasus, the figures were said to be about 18% showing up. The spring call-up was repeated, and the Defense Ministry announced that they had gotten pretty close to their required figures later, but I find that not very believable. In November, for the second call-up of the year, another revolt happened, more or less the same, and it happened in every succeeding call-up every 6 months for the rest of the period of the Soviet Union, and it's still going on. Now, Gorbachev apparently failed to realize Peter Struve's assessment of the role of the army in Russia. This is the very essence of the official being of Russia. It had always been the foundation of the state, and now Gorbachev was allowing it to be destroyed. This is the most strange because he found it necessary already in 1986 to use the military to put down national separatist movements. In Kazakhstan, most of them have forgotten Kazakhstan, but because he did not allow foreign journalists in there, he had 5 or 6, about 15 or 20 students tried and sent to jail for a long period of time. How many were killed in the streets, I don't know, but 5 students were executed. And there wasn't much hue and cry about that. and the press did much reporting on it. But then in 1989, in Georgia in the spring, there was, when the military was used to put down, to close a demonstration of young people, someone actually videotaped soldiers using shovels actually beating to death 18 Georgian girls in front of one of the public buildings there. And then the next year in Azerbaijan in 1990, and in the Baltic states, both in 1990 and 91, he had to use military force. He had backed the generals in Kazakhstan, but after that, when it didn't work and the butchery became public, he began to refuse to take the blame for it and push it off on the generals. This shook them. They did not know how to respond, but they became cautious thereafter about carrying out such repressions. Now that was a situation in August 1991 when his colleagues attempted to reverse perestroika. You remember the emergency committee which tried a so-called push, incarcerated Gorbachev at his dacha while he was on vacation in the Crimea. By this time, however, the army was a shambles. The generals were all hedging their bets. Most Western analysts call this August crisis a failed coup. I call it in my book a successful coup. The emergency committee actually believed that Gorbachev would support them, as I discovered in my research, and thought that he would quietly go along and that they would bring him back after they restored order to appease the West. But he refused to go along, I think primarily not because he didn't want that outcome, but he didn't want to be compromised in the case it failed. Yeltsin surprised everyone with his defense of the White House. No one was ready for it. And when the crisis was over and Gorbachev had been rescued, the real power was now in Yeltsin's hands, not in Gorbachev's. So it seems to me it really was a coup. And General Lebed, whom I'm sure you've heard about, the politician who ran for the presidency in 1996, when he learned in downtown Moscow about noon on Monday of the coup, the so-called push, he saw the list of people in this emergency committee. He says, what kind of push is this? These are already the most powerful people in the country. Why should they take the power? They have it. And I think he was right. But by Thursday morning, they didn't have the power, but Yeltsin had the power. And on Monday, he didn't have the power. So I think he really succeeded. Now, Gorbachev had totally misjudged the nationality question and the military question. The Soviet Union might have a new ideology, a revolutionary ideology after 1917, but structurally, it had all of the old problems of the Russian imperial period. In fact, the Soviet system was not so much a change as an intensification of all three of these old problems. You can argue that it was a throwback to pre-1861 when the peasants were still serfs, that the collective farmers were just reinserfed peasants. But under this new system, the economy was again stagnating and declining, and the regime was corrupt from top to bottom, and the nationalists were waiting for their opportunity. He had also misjudged this economic question. He knew it was the problem and that the military was a large part of the blame, but he simply did not understand that a systemic shift to a market economy would be required if he genuinely wanted a solution. Now, let me end my remarks with with a story and a couple of general observations. First, the story. I asked Edward Shevardnadze, who was a member of the Politburo, and you may remember the foreign minister in most of Gorbachev's years, during a 6-hour dinner I was fortunate to attend where he was present in Tbilisi in 1993. I asked him if he understood that perestroika and glasnost would destroy the Soviet Union, if he understood that when they launched this policy. He answered yes. But I believed we had 3 to 5 years longer for a softer landing. So he admitted he'd been surprised at the timing, but he didn't equivocate at all about what he saw as the likely result of this, and he seemed to be not opposed to it. In other words, well, as I've just said, then I asked if Gorbachev understood. And he said, not at all, especially not the danger from the national minorities, that was just something he didn't grasp. He thought they had become too intertwined economically and mixed geographically for that to be a serious problem anymore. Then the third question I asked, did any other Politburo member understand what you understood? He pondered for a moment and he said, probably Yakovlev. 6 months later, I had the chance to sit next to Yakovlev at a dinner, so I just took the opportunity to ask him the same questions. And he was one of the closest allies to Gorbachev in the reforms. In fact, he is alleged, and I think reliably so, to have provided a lot of the rhetoric, a lot of the theory, so-called theory, behind the perestroika idea and glasnost. Now, he insisted that he knew that they would destroy the Soviet Union when they began perestroika. And he declared that Gorbachev totally misunderstood the nationality danger and that he also had no sense of what the economic problems were. Then I asked the third question, who else understood the danger? He thought for a moment and said, probably Shevardnadze. Now, you might dismiss one of these stories as a post facto justification, but I do not believe that both men could have coordinated this story of the facts in such a perfect way. So I'm inclined to take them at their word. Now, what this means to me is that Gorbachev is really the all-time great inadvertent revolutionary. Thank goodness he did not understand, or he probably would have never initiated the programs. And thank goodness for Shevardnadze and Yakovlev, who were there to assist him in this undertaking. Now for the generalizations. First, I think the collapse of the Soviet Union has truly broken this old vicious circle of the three questions, the economic, the military, and the nationalities. As long as it persisted, a liberal democratic development in Russia was impossible. There was no way for Gorbachev to succeed in creating a liberal democratic Soviet Union. Empires just cannot introduce liberalism without breaking up. Letting the national minorities separate and renouncing expansionist ideologies also mean that the military no longer has a justification for a priority claim on the economy. Thus, for the first time, Russia has a chance to let consumer demand drive economic development, not military imperatives. Now, second point, the collapse does not ensure a liberal liberal political development. It only makes it conceivable. The legacies from the Soviet system, especially the military sector, industrial sector, are so great that the prospects of a liberal democratic development and a market economic development seem very small. The Deputy Secretary of State, Strobe Talbot, says periodically that Russia is on the right road, only not making rapid enough progress. I simply see no case for that view. Some of the old legacies persist, so many of them persist, that the country is not on the right road. Rather, it's on a road to a condition very common in many large parts of the world. The traditional weak state syndrome, ripe with corruption, no effective legal system, unable to control many of its federal components, unable to tax effectively, unable to regulate its banks effectively, and trapped in this situation for what will probably be the indefinite future. Now, I think Americans have trouble admitting that this predicament is not necessarily temporary, that it can persist for decades, as it has in Nigeria, in Peru, Brazil, India, Egypt, and many other countries. One might even argue that that is the norm, and that we in the strong states of Western Europe are exceptions. And if this is the case, then I think there's very little we can do objectively for Russia. There is no government that can answer responsibly for the whole country. There is no bureaucracy that can effectively use our aid. Almost any economic assistance would be used for avoiding collecting local taxes, and then it would be stolen by the officials. Russia may sign treaties, but they will not necessarily be implemented, not because of ill intent of the signers, but because of the incapacity of the bureaucracy to carry through on the implementation. The ramifications are far more fundamental than most of us are willing to recognize. At the same time, the military cannot be restored to its old status at any time soon. Russia, I don't think, can return in 10 years to a great power military status. It can, however, I think, regenerate significant military power, and I think you will see more evidence of that. There's already some signs that a key parts of the military-industrial sector have been salvaged and are no longer completely in a state of deterioration. Now, nor do I think it can become a Weimar Germany transiting into a Nazi Germany. Germany, think about the comparison. Germany was not a weak state with lousy institutions and a corrupt bureaucracy and a collapsed military, despised by the population. Germany's military retained its stature, and its population was young, healthy, and growing, not old, diseased, and declining. Russia does not have a world-class industrial base. Germany did. Russia has a declining industrial base where almost no factory is viable in a global market economy, and not all that many even are viable in a protected Russian market for an indefinite future. Just let me end by emphasizing that the situation, I think, is far more desperate in Russia than we realize. Thank you for your attention, and I will now take questions.
Thank you very much, General. Let's give him a warm. I think you can see why presidents of both parties have called on his wise counsel over the years as they've wrestled with very tough foreign policy and military questions. As the moderator, I get to ask the first question, so let me throw you one that hopefully won't be too hard here, General. But you argue very effectively in your book that the Soviet military has been at the heart of Russian life for centuries. To what degree do you think the Soviet military's victories in World War II helped legitimize Marxist-Leninist communist ideology, that the credibility of the military helped prop up that approach to statecraft?
That is a good question, and the answer, I think, is fairly obvious. The victory in World War II, I think, had begun to transcend the revolution in 1917 as the legitimizing event for the regime. There were real doubts in many people's minds that the Bolsheviks could hold on. After all, the Bolsheviks were a very small circle within the Marxist parties in Europe, and also the majority of Russian Marxists were not Bolsheviks, they were Mensheviks, and they were either forced to emigrate or killed, or a few of them made the transition to Bolshevism. And they said, you can't establish a working class dictatorship in a backward peasant country where the workers are in a tiny minority and the peasants are an overwhelming majority. Peasant interest and worker interest are going to clash because peasants want to own property. They are petty capitalists. So if you're a Marxist, class struggle, the peasants should be the predominant class. And the regime should reflect their economic interest. How was Lenin going to overcome this? He expected the leading working class in Europe, the German working class, to overthrow that regime and for it to spread into Britain and France, and then that working class would come and rescue the Russian proletariat. So that many of the emigres for the next 10, 15 years were outside saying, look, they can't make it. They're eventually going to collapse, or they're going to become de facto a new bourgeois regime. After World War II, this regime showed that it could have German troops reach all the way to Moscow and recover. And that gave it, I think, it's hard unless you've been there to see what an icon the Soviet military was. Everybody was involved in it. Everybody was in it. And so it was the state.
Next question. Is it not possible that Gorbachev was an authentic humanist and proceeded knowing that only a major crisis would lead to transformation and pursued this route as an alternative to nuclear war?
Well, the reason I don't think that's the case is that if you read the diaries, if I have of his closest aide, Chernayev, and the memoirs of people who were working for him, all other people working for him, like Shakhnazarov, Valery Baldin, and a number of others close to him, and you see how utterly duplicitous he was, how utterly ruthless he could be, You don't find this person there. He had no problem having people shot. It wasn't a problem. What he didn't want was the blame. He was really it's quite clear to me that he verbally gave the word to General Rodionov and to Marshal Yazov to do this bloody deed down in Tbilisi in April 1989. I think Shevardnadze, I didn't ask him this because I thought it would be an embarrassing question. I'm sure Shevardnadze believes that he did it. And it shook Shevardnadze, who's a Georgian. I don't think he ever got over that. But Gorbachev didn't have any problem with that whatsoever. Another Politburo member, who was only a Politburo member for a small period of time, it was Niyazov, Super Muradov. Niyazov is the president of Turkmenistan. He had been the head of the party in Turkmenistan, and 1990 to the end of the Soviet Union, all the heads of Republican parties became members of the Politburo. He told this little story during a visit I took to his country. He said that when the Nagorno-Karabakh war broke out, and when they sent troops into Baku to put down the National Front movement there, he heard Gorbachev say in the halls of the Central Committee building, "The more they fight, the more they bleed, the more they'll depend on us." And Niyazov and many other people thought that Gorbachev actually started intentionally the Nagorno-Karabakh fight to prevent centrifugal forces taking place. The idea that he was not behind this coup is also, I have a different interpretation here, you know, of Gorbachev's behavior in the coup. He couldn't have left town on August 7th or 8th in 1991 without realizing he was inviting a coup. The number of things that had happened in the spring pointing to it was just overwhelming. He was going to come back ostensibly to sign this new Union treaty, which was, although it was a new treaty, I mean, it looked like a new Union, substance of it would essentially mean there wouldn't be a Soviet Union anymore. So he really didn't want to do that. So and my own suspicion is that he hoped somebody would take it over, but he was much too slippery, much too duplicitous to tell somebody that this is part of his scheme. So when they came down and tried to get him to participate in it, oh, I'm not going to do that. In fact, Baklanov actually said, "Mikhail Sergeyevich, oh, please, sign the papers. You don't have to. You just stay here and be quiet for a while. We'll restore order, and then you can come back." And wait, with Gorbachev, is he clever enough to leave evidence with someone that he was duplicitous? The KGB has put out rumors that he was duplicitous. I don't think they'll ever prove it. I think it's not because he isn't guilty, it's because he's much too clever for that. I'll give you another evidence of his democratic credentials, liberal credentials. It's November 1991. The new Minister of Defense is Air Marshal, Marshal of Aviation Shapishnikov. He invites him to the Kremlin, 9 at night, for a one-on-one meeting. Shapishnikov told me this personally, and I'm sitting there, my jaw drops open when he tells me. He's invited for a meeting. Gorbachev treats him very nicely, unusually warm to him. He doesn't use the informal T form in Russian, which is to put him down, but treats him sort of as an equal. Said, you know, we have to think through the variants of saving the Union. It's about to fall apart. And to restore order, and then after a time step aside. Shapishnikov said, "Mikhail Sergeyevich, didn't we have something like that a few months ago?" "Oh, no, I didn't mean that. I didn't mean that." Now, I argue in my book that I think there's a strong circumstantial evidence that when Shapishnikov wouldn't go along with pulling a military coup to save Gorbachev in November, that he then went to his underling, or perhaps was already working with his underling, the chief of the General Staff, General Lobov. Because Lobov, strangely, tried to pull the General Staff out from under the Defense Ministry, even after the Collegium of the Defense Ministry had voted against it. Unprecedented. He must have realized he had a party sponsor outside of the Defense Ministry. On December the 7th, he was relieved from his job. He was in London. They said, you're fired. That's the very day that Yeltsin, Shushkevich, and Kravchuk met in Byelovizhsky Push in Belarus and signed the agreement on the new dissolution of the Soviet Union and the creation of a Commonwealth of Independent States. It's my own just supposition, I can't prove this, a very tentative hypothesis, that they begin to realize in November that Gorbachev was going to make a run on them. And they did this very quickly to preempt Gorbachev in this. So when I put all that together, I just don't see, I see the case for an extremely arrogant man. Now maybe he had some human impulses, some of his language is certainly that way. I personally think if he had been the kind of liberal that we'd like to believe he was in the West, he could have never done it. I think all this what we would consider really foul character was essential training and essential talents for unraveling this thing from the top. I think anybody who'd been sort of a straightforward liberal wouldn't have gotten to first base.
How significant is organized crime in Russia, and what role, if any, does it play in the military today?
That's a big question. I'll just give you a short answer to it. Don't take some of the scare stories about the crime. There's plenty of crime. I'm not saying there isn't lots of crime. It's a problem of classifying what it is and what you classify crime and what you don't classify crime. Let me give you an example. Suppose you are running a company here and you sign a contract with another company to supply you with something. They don't supply you with it. You have a contract dispute. You would go to court, wouldn't you? To lawyers. Well, you went to court in Russia. You might find a court, but you probably wouldn't. But you could. You might. If you did, suppose you go and you actually win the dispute. The judges are very unused to settling these contract disputes because under the old command economic system as an administrative matter, they didn't even understand the idea. I have no contract law in the sense that we do. But forget those issues. Let's get over them and say, okay, so you have the settlement. Who's going to enforce it? The fellow who's violated just smiles and says, make me. Well, then what do? You turn to a security company, an all-service security company. They not only provide guards for your place, but a couple of their guys go down and see this guy. And you say, you don't pay? Zap. You know, no court charges, just 2 bullets. So, in a sense, some of the functions that we have in the government, they've privatized. No, I'm seriously joking. A lot of what goes on known as crime is if you want to be a tourist, yeah, if you want to go to Russia today, I wouldn't fear for you. You're reasonably safe out there in the streets. That's not a problem. Now, you're not safe if you start dealing in business with these people, unless you're just wanting to be ripped off. As long as they will keep you around as long as they can steal from you. But if you start trying to make an excessive profit that they don't want to see you make, then, you know, it's more hazardous. There are gangs, there are little mafias. And mafias, remember, what is a mafia? It's not just a criminal gang. It's a particular kind. It's an effort to create a government that taxes local businesses to compete with the legitimate. It's an illegitimate government taxing. It keeps order within the area where it is. It's very, if you go to New Jersey, not far from where my wife grew up, and go over to the mafia part of town, it's very safe over there. Well, I think in the kiosk business and other small business areas in Moscow and St. Petersburg and some of these cities, you do see that kind of mafia. But that kind of mafia runs into a roof. Then you get into the bankers who are playing all sorts of games. Do you call them criminals or not? Are they in the government or not? Do you call corrupt, do you call it gangsterism when officials, the system still requires all the paperwork and much of the regulatory paperwork that it did in the Soviet period to get a business or some economic activity going. If you have to pay off each one of these people, is that crime and corruption? Well, let me just stop and say, I think that's enough to make you realize it's a very multifaceted phenomena that gets too easily labeled a crime. And it's too easy to say, well, the mafia is running Russia. Well, that was true when the Communist Party was there because it always considered itself above the law. And I was once told in 1974 by a Soviet official, he said, if you really want to understand our government, go see your movie, The Godfather. And in a sense, the Communist Party was above the law, and the Communist Party, you know, the General Secretary, he was the godfather. And that was not a bad model.
I'll let that one stay there. You note that Gorbachev didn't recognize how glasnost and perestroika would irreversibly change the Soviet Union. Did President Reagan recognize it? If so, when?
You know, I didn't interview him for this book, so but I can tell you when George Shultz seemed to me, who was the Secretary of State, realized it. I took some material down to him once and went into his office, and he looked up at me and said, "Bill, have you read Gorbachev's new book?" This was about early 1988 or late 1987. I said, I had a copy of it in Russian. I haven't read it. He said, "You should read that." So I went home and read it. It was astounding. That's where I ran into these ideological revisions. And I said, I can't believe this. If you want to get a sense of how, what the impact of these ideological revisions in his book were for a Westerner, imagine the Pope having his lead cardinal on questions of theology write a treatise that said, well, you know, the virgin birth and the resurrection and all this, that was true back in the Middle Ages, but it's not true anymore. Now, you know, we know it was nonsense, and sin and all that was true, but it says now we have these new interests which we share with the devil, so we can now start cooperating with the devil to save the world. How long, what do you think this would do to the state of the Roman Catholic Church? Well, this is essentially what Gorbachev was doing to, no wonder Ligachev 2 or 3 months later says on public television when he thinks Gorbachev's not listening because he's on vacation, said, you know, to talk about humankind interest is to confuse our own citizens and to absolutely confuse our friends abroad. And he was right. So, well, I'll just, I think Shultz understood that. Reagan, I think, probably understood from Reykjavik. And let me explain why I think this is the case. In my book, I tell the story of Mitterrand visiting Moscow. Gorbachev very early established very warm personal relations with all the European leaders. You remember how Maggie Thatcher fell for him. We could do business with this man. And they loved Maggie Thatcher in Moscow. She lectured Gorbachev, and he just loved to be lectured by her. And this is the big job. But they always made fun of Reagan, calling him a B-grade movie actor. And making fun of Reagan was sort of you know, a house game in there. Well, during Mitterrand's visit, they were, with the French, they were laughing at Reagan. What a nut he was, sort of a fool, not a serious fellow. And in the course of this discussion, Mitterrand drew back and said, wait a minute. You do have to admit there's a real human being there who has an instinct for an important historical moment. Gorbachev was absolutely astonished. He says, this is the most important information you've brought. He went on vacation, initiated action, which led a few months later to the summit at Reykjavik. At Reykjavik, his staff thought he had had a meeting with the president with Reagan in 1985 in Geneva, but that hadn't gone well. But this is 1986. At Reykjavik, those of you who remember here on our side, we thought it was near disaster that Reagan came close to giving up Star Wars and everything else. A lot of his staff thought he'd gone mushy in the head. And Gorbachev's staff thought that because they hadn't gotten rid of Star Wars and some of the things that the general staff wanted, that they had lost. So they're sitting around on the airplane going back, lamenting what a disaster had been. Gorbachev comes back at Bunya. He says, it was a great success. I made a personal breakthrough with Reagan. He and I established human contact. So I think Gorbachev really was skilled there. And I think after that, Reagan and Shultz both knew that you could take these forces way down in arms control agreements if he wanted to do it. And one of the interesting things to me that I was surprised about in the book, if you're a good student of Marxism, Leninism, and Soviet politics, you realize personal relations should play no role in politics. That is to become confused with subjective factors instead of objective factors. You can't ever imagine Stalin or Lenin making a personal breakthrough with Roosevelt. That's the last thing you want to do. But to find Gorbachev brought up, steeped in all this ideology and all this background, leaning so heavily on the subjective aspect of these personal relations, came to me as a bit of a surprise. They became so important for him personally that one of his staff aides said that a few of the trips for the West would largely improve his morale. It was so depressing at home with the opposition that he would go abroad to reinvigorate himself. So I think clearly they did, and I think Bush and Baker saw it. One of his closest, Shevardnadze's closest aides said, "You handled us very well in diplomacy. You knew when to give us enough to keep Shevardnadze going." And by the time, by the end of the Reagan period, in the early part of the Bush period, the staff levels on both sides were collaborating, sometimes against the chiefs on both sides. And it was a remarkable period of diplomacy.
Time for just a couple more questions, so let's turn to Yugoslavia. As a consequence of the NATO action in Yugoslavia, will this strengthen the hardline communists in Russia?
You know, if you recall what I said about the nature of a weak state in Russia, and if you're watching what Yeltsin's doing, you can hardly call him a roaring liberal. You can't call anybody there a roaring liberal. It's not so clear to me that it makes much difference who's elected. I don't think the communists can put a communist system back together. I take note that in Bulgaria, the communists were re-elected, and they stayed in about a year and a half, which time they absolutely created an incredible mess. The public was so upset with them, they've thrown out the communists now. And I think Bulgaria is permanently inoculated against the communists. You could argue that maybe Russia needs another 6 months or a year of communism for permanent inoculation. But if you look at the public opinion polls, you don't see the support for them. Now, because they are an organized party, because of other mechanisms, presumably they could take power. But they don't have a formula to revive the economy. They don't have formulas to make it worse. My sympathy would go out for the Russian people if this happened. I don't think it would make a lot of difference to us in the West. So that would be my short answer to that.
How, if at all, would Russia become involved in the current military operations in Europe? Under what kind of scenarios can you foresee that
Well,
happening?
if you mean Yugoslavia. You know, in principle, they could send a few volunteers. They might have trouble getting there. They'd have to get civilian airline tickets to fly in. But Russia doesn't have the capacity to fly troops in there or to run trainloads of support in, unless the Romanians and Bulgarians were to open it up and send it in for them. And the Bulgarians don't like Milosevic very much, and I don't think the regime in Romania has particular love for him, although some of the opposition apparently see something in his approach. So I think what we're going to see is increasing, what we've seen thus far are these expressions of anger and hostility to us, which reflect enormous frustration at being so weak and so unimportant and so insignificant for the outcomes down there. I noticed that 2 days ago or a day ago, the NTV in Russia is now showing pictures of the atrocities. Why would they be doing this? One Russian analyst said that he sees the regime beginning to trim its sails because it wants to keep good relations with the West for IMF loans and else. So, as I said and I wrote this long before before this war started, I said Russia is not that important. There's a real danger in U.S. policy that we haven't gotten far enough past the Russia first. Russia is important. It's an important country, but it's not that important. The really important countries for the U.S. are Japan and the Far East and Germany and Europe. And the reason the U.S.-German connection is acceptable to all of Europe is because it's housed in NATO. So the essence, the real military, political guts of the alliance are this German-American military alliance. If you look back over the century, as I've said before in this room, when we've had strong military ties with Germany, you have no war, you don't have big wars in Europe. When we have no ties or bad relations with Germany, we have wars in Europe. The same thing is true in the Pacific with Japan. QED, the most important things for U.S. policy in the post-Cold War order are U.S.-German and U.S.-Japanese relations. If those remain solid, I think we can manage the other very difficult problems, and I'm not saying most of them won't be difficult. But if either one of those breaks, the problems will be very unmanageable. Imagine Germany not wanting to play in this game in Yugoslavia today. So that would be the, I think they're not the key player in this.
Final question. What trends or influences do you think will impact our military over the next 5 or 10 years?
It depends very much on the role we choose to play in the world. If we want to keep the U.S.-German and U.S.-Japanese military ties and those alliance structures, we're going to need a fairly significant military. If we let them unravel, as we could well do in the Yugoslav case, then I suppose we won't need all those troops in Europe. We have a very big naval force and marine force, and we have what I think is dangerously small tactical air force and ground force. So for the kinds of problems we're dealing with today, we're in an imbalance. A huge attack submarine fleet and a carrier fleet doesn't do much against Milosevic, nor does it do much against Kim Jong-il in Korea or against Saddam Hussein in Iraq. Finally, those issues will have to be resolved by ground forces and adequate air support. So if we're going to keep reasonable stability, not all over the whole world, I'm not an advocate of the U.S. being the world's policeman, but there are 2 zones where I think it's pretty unambiguous. If we're going to play this role, we have to be involved and be willing to intervene, take casualties if necessary. And that's in Northeast Asia and Europe. I was not for going into Somalia because I don't see that as critical or a place that could lead to the unraveling of Europe. I could be wrong, and very intelligent people and make persuasive arguments that we can wall off the Balkans and not worry about it. I'm inclined to think that this will not stop in Serbia, but it's going to go on into Macedonia, probably involve Bulgaria, probably involve Albania. Then we could well see the same thing happen in the Transylvanian part of Romania, where there are large Hungarian majority. So, having failed to get ahead of this in 1992, I advocated in 1992 that NATO put ground forces in every republic in the former Yugoslavia, but Slovenia. Put them in fire bases where they could not be easily knocked off, and sit there and stay ahead of this kind of activity and make sure that liberal politics had a chance in those, in all of those republics, and that people like Milosevic, and I would even take people like Tudjman in Croatia and Izetbegovic in Bosnia and others as old communists. Until they're gone, I don't think you're going to get a real change in politics there. And I think if we'd done that, we wouldn't be in this situation today. The fact that we put a company plus or a battalion under the UN aegis into Macedonia, I think explains that you have not had a big crisis in Macedonia yet. So, if we sort of kick the can on down the road and reach some sort of agreement after this bombing with Milosevic, then we're going to have another round of it. If we take him out, if we occupy and put forces in, then we may get ahead of this. If we just keep kicking it down the track, then I think you're going to see the viability of the alliance and the U.S. commitment there slowly but surely erode. And where that leads, it's hard for me to say, but I think in addition to it being a moral and political issue for us all personally, it will finally be a big pocketbook issue for the United States. But that's my view, and there are very compelling arguments made by people of other persuasions.
Well, thank you all very much. I'm sorry we couldn't get to all the questions today. Appreciate your coming out very much. Please help yourself to the materials on the table to learn more about the Institute, and look forward to having you here again soon. And join me in thanking General Odom again.
Thank you for coming.
Thank you.